Hey there, so this is day 3 of the 21-day best-selling author platform, and in this step we're going to talk about book design. I was actually a book designer. I started off as a book editor. I was a book designer for about a decade, and now I mostly write my own books, but I have a lot of courses and templates on book design still that bring a lot of traffic because book cover design is one of the most important things for self-publishing. It's more than anything else, it's the face of your book. It does the most work in terms of visibility and marketing. So when you're advertising or when you're promoting or whatever, people will look at the cover first. If the cover doesn't attract them and let them know what the genre is, then they're not going to read the blurb. So your blurb or your reviews, they're also super important, but they're the next step after the cover has passed the test. And generally it's a pass-fail, which means it either works or it doesn't. However, I labeled this step how to make a beautifully designed book that people would want to sleep with, because there's an advantage to having, an over-the-top beautiful book. One of the books that people say, like, I want to lick that book cover, I want to sleep with that book cover. If it's just so gorgeous, the book cover itself can be a selling feature. But the danger is you really want to hit the standards of your audience and your target categories and genres before you try to do anything creative. And this is the huge disconnect between book cover design in general, because most authors will think, I didn't write, like I talked about in the last video, they will say, I didn't write a commercial book, I don't want to be commercial. They might say, I hate how all the book covers look in my target genre. I want something that stands out and that, is mysterious or makes people curious. People will not click on your book cover and think about it and wonder what all the pieces mean. That's not going to happen. Your book cover has to just immediately communicate the genre, and that's where a lot of book covers fail. There are ways to very cheaply self-publish and get a good enough book cover. I've got book cover templates at DIYbookcovers.com. I've got tons of tutorials about book cover design in Photoshop or other online tools. It is possible to do it yourself, but if you do it wrong, it's also gonna really cost you. It's gonna be very hard to get any visibility. Even if you've done everything else right, even if your book is amazing, the book cover really does make a big difference. So there's 3 basic ways to build a book cover. Generally, you want to have one humanizing element, which is going to be a person probably, and then one background, which is going to be a scene or location. You probably want one color scheme. So instead of having like a bunch of random colors, you'll have a color wash, which is like, this is all blue or all purple or whatever. And then you'll have a contrasting color. So whatever the opposite of your dominant color is, often it's flesh tone. So if you have a person that's flesh toned, then the background will be all blue or all green or all purple. And then the person will stand out more. You'll also have a lot of contrast with lighting. So you have a lot of dark and shadows, and then usually there's a glow around the person. If you don't like people covers, right now in fantasy, for example, it's more of a trend to symbolic covers. People covers sold better for a long time. And there's also a weird thing where traditional publishers don't have to get the book cover right. They can do something cool and creative because the book is not sold by the cover. It's usually in bookstores. People have more time to flip the book over and read the back copy or flip through the first couple pages. If you're self-publishing, most of your sales are going to be on Amazon. And so what happens is that indie self-publishing authors tend to perform better on Amazon because they are trying. Traditional publishers, they're not really trying to sell on Amazon. They're not really advertising. They're not building covers that perform well online. They're building covers that perform well for bookstores. So you don't want to compete with what traditional publishers are doing. You want to see what's actually best selling now in your categories on Amazon or the other online bookstores. And you may think they're cheesy and even poorly designed sometimes, but there's a reason that certain things work. Of course, you want a really well put together, well designed cover. It's very obvious if a cover is professionally designed versus self-made or amateur. But just because something's well designed and beautiful doesn't mean it's going to sell books. It's more important to fit in with the other books that are best selling in your category. And a lot of authors, they start off with an idea or a scene, or like, I want this scene from my book with all these characters and all these things happening, usually like movement and clothing and like facial expressions. None of that stuff is going to matter because people don't look at book covers long enough. They just kind of glance at, basically, does this look like urban fantasy or epic fantasy? Basically, is this a memoir or a nonfiction how-to book? There are ways to signify very quickly what your book is about, and that's what the cover's job is to do. It should be beautiful if you can help it, but it needs to fit in more than anything else. It needs to communicate the maximum amount of information as quickly as possible so that when people just glance at the cover, they know that this is the type of book that they want to read. It's similar to other books that they have enjoyed in the past. That's what you need your cover to do. So part of it is research. Look at what's best selling in the target categories on Amazon. A big part of it is fonts, because the fonts communicate the genre. The picture kind of gets the scene or the setting, maybe the time period or the genre, but more than anything else, the type of typography for the title, that's what really communicates the genre more than anything else. So like the difference between a sci-fi book and a fantasy book is mostly the font that you use on the title. So it's really important to get the right font and not just use like a basic serif or sans serif font for your book cover. Like I said, I've got resources on DIY book covers, or I've got templates that are really useful to start out. There's also a lot of places to get art. And like I mentioned, I personally prefer people covers because I think they convert better. But you can get away with a symbolic cover, which are a little bit understated and more subtle. In my experience, it's a little bit harder because those are less obvious about what the genre is. They don't communicate as much. So if you're like, you might notice the really big authors who have big advertising budgets, they may be using symbolic covers, but maybe it won't work if you're just starting off with, no platform and your first book, and you need your book cover to convert as powerfully as possible. There are things that you might need to do with no platform when you're first starting out that big established authors who have a lot of followers, they don't need to do those things anymore, which is why I still recommend people covers. Your covers need a humanizing element because stories are about people. So even if you just have a landscape, like a lot of thriller covers will have like a spooky forest or a cabin, maybe like a child's tricycle toy on the ground, symbolizing the missing child. Sometimes it can be like that, where you have an object that communicates a humanizing element. There's a story there. There's a character there. You don't want a cover that just doesn't tell any story. That's just a place without any people, because stories are about people. Anyway, I have a lot more resources about cover design, but the main takeaway here is that your cover is super important and you've got to get it right. It doesn't necessarily mean you need to hire an expensive cover designer. I do have a list of cover designers that I recommend and that I like. A really good cover design tends to be about $500, but you can sometimes get a pre-made for $100 or $200 that's pretty good. I could go on about talking with designers. I will real quick just because I'm talking about it, but sometimes it's easier to buy a pre-made cover that's better than a custom cover, because when you do a custom cover, you're probably telling the designer exactly what to make, and the designer is limited by your feedback. The author usually doesn't know what's going to work for a book cover design. So you may get a designer who does exactly what you want and what you think should be on the cover, but it's not the thing that really should be on the cover to sell your book to your audience. A good cover designer will know that, and hopefully they'll push back a little bit and say, yeah, I can make that for you, but that's not going to be successful. Often, like when I work with clients, it's always a little bit of a balance. Sometimes the client gets what they want and I'm not at all happy with the cover, and then they might come back to me later and say, oh, actually, I want to use the cover you recommended because I'm not selling any books. That happens pretty often. So be open-minded, even if you're hiring a designer, that you don't necessarily know, and you don't necessarily want to know what's going to sell your book to your audience. Because if you want to learn to be a book cover designer, that's a skill that's going to take years, and it's not very important if you just want to sell books to your audience. You want to be a writer, and the temptation is, because you're a creative person, you might get way too invested in the book cover design process. For my first book, I definitely did that. I painted a whole painting on a canvas, took a picture, added a ton of crappy Photoshop stuff, spent months on a cover that was awful, and I did that, for years, making my own covers and putting way too much time and effort into them that just weren't good at all. Now I tend to just buy good, cheap pre-mates if I find them, or I've learned a lot about how to just design a cover. And even now, like I'm currently updating all of my covers from books that have been successful over the last 6 or 7 years, because cover designs change every couple of years. So I still want like the best covers right now, and the cover I put out 6 years ago probably aren't as good as I could do now. And I update my covers pretty frequently. So it can be expensive if you're paying for book cover design, but also keep in mind, if you're not selling, your cover is probably the reason that you're having trouble getting people to read your books. And you want to be open to testing out different versions of a cover, not little tiny things. I see a lot of people asking for feedback and they're like, which of these 3 do you like? But they're all basically the same. If it's little tiny things, it's not going to have a statistical difference in terms of sales or conversion. But if it's a totally different concept, you might want to test them out. That's something that indie publishers can do. I could run ads for a week, get 100 clicks to a book and then change the cover and do the same thing and see which one has better conversion. I don't do that all the time. Most authors don't do that all the time, but definitely keep in mind that, even if you do your absolute best, even if you hire a professional designer, your cover still might be the problem later on. So keep in mind that that's kind of the easiest thing to fix. It can have the biggest difference and impact. In the next video, we're going to be talking about putting it all together and publishing a book. Thanks. Bye-bye.